"To the only woman a Marchetti could ever marry," he said, lifting his glass, and I smiled, because for one more second I still believed he meant me. I had baked since 4 that morning. I stood in my own small kitchen while the city was still dark and rolled out dough with my grandmother's cracked wooden pin, the one with the burn mark on the handle, and I shaped 24 vanilla bean tarts by hand. Because tonight was supposed to be the night everything changed. My name is Naomi Carter. For 8 years I have carried trays into rooms like this one, and I was good at it, good enough that Ethan Marchetti once told me my hands were the most honest thing he had ever watched work. He told me to wear the navy dress. He told me tonight would change everything, and I let myself believe, like a fool, like a girl, that the change was going to be mine. So when he raised that crystal glass under the enormous chandelier and 200 faces turned toward him, my heart floated up into my throat. Then Chelsea Vance stepped out from behind the marble column in a gown the color of fresh cream, and Ethan reached for her hand, and a diamond I had never seen caught the light and threw it straight into my eyes. The tray did not fall. My fingers went white around the cold silver rim, and my breath stopped behind my ribs, and the whole gilded room tilted half an inch. But the tray did not fall, because it was the one thing left in the world that I could still hold. Applause bloomed around me like weather. Somebody called out congratulations, and another voice picked it up, and I stood in the exact center of all that light holding 24 little tarts that nobody was ever going to eat. Chelsea found me over Ethan's shoulder, and that was when I understood she had known all along. It was in the small, satisfied curve of her mouth, in the slow way her eyes traveled from my apron up to my face and settled there, patient and pleased, a woman watching the last piece of a plan click into place. Ethan did not look at me at all. That is the part that folded something in half inside my chest, not the ring, not the gown, but the way his gaze slid across the room and passed over me the way it would pass over any hired girl he had paid and would forget by breakfast. I had cooled this man's fever at 2 in the morning and co-signed his careless lies to his own accountant. I had a drawer at home full of sketches we drew together for a bakery we swore we would open, my recipes, his name beside mine above the door. And he lifted his glass to another woman and let a whole ballroom watch him do it, and he could not spare me 1 second of his eyes. Near the front, a woman in emerald silk turned to see what Chelsea was staring at. Her gaze landed on me, on the apron, on the tray, and her lip curled with the particular disgust of a person who has already decided your worth before you say one word. I did not know yet that her name was Diane Marchetti, or that within the hour she would say the cruelest thing I heard all night. I only knew my hands were still full and my job was not finished, and that a woman like me does not weep in a client's ballroom. So I turned on legs that did not feel like mine, carried the tray to the dessert table, set it down without a sound, and straightened each little tart in its neat row, the way you straighten the one thing left in the world that you can still control. And that was when I felt it, before I ever saw it, the way you feel a door open behind you in a warm room. Someone at the head of the long table had stopped clapping. Someone was watching me instead of the happy couple. When I finally lifted my eyes, his were already fixed on mine, gray and steady and utterly unreadable, and I did not yet know that a single look from that man was about to break my whole life open and build it into something new. For the next hour, I did the job I was paid to do, and I did it well, because that was the only dignity nobody in that room could take from me. I refilled the coffee urns until my wrists ached. I swapped the empty trays for full ones. I moved along the edges of the party like a shadow with steady hands while the man I had loved led another woman across the floor in a slow circle, the future he had promised me draped on somebody else's shoulders. People noticed me, and that was the worst of it. I would have given anything to be invisible, but a black woman in an apron at a Marchetti party is the most visible person in the room and the least seen, both at the very same time. I felt the glances land and slide away. I heard the whispers pressed behind lifted glasses. I caught the pity, which is somehow heavier than cruelty, because pity looks down at you while it asks you to be grateful. A waiter I had worked a dozen events with squeezed my arm as he passed and said nothing, and his silence was kinder than any words spoken aloud in that gleaming hall. Then Diane Marchetti crossed the floor toward me. She moved the way wealthy women move when they have never once been told no, emerald silk whispering against the marble, a champagne glass held out before her like a scepter. She stopped a foot away and looked me up and down, slow and deliberate. The way you inspect a thing you already suspect is not worth the price. You can clear the east tables now, she said, loud, pitched for the little circle of guests near her. And do try not to make a scene, dear. I understand it must be confusing for you, but you are always just the help. Ethan has such a soft heart. He lets these little arrangements go on far too long. The laughter that followed was soft and horrible, a ripple moving through the guests around her, and I felt each small sound land on my skin. The heat climbed my neck, my ears, the backs of my hands. Across the room, Chelsea watched with her chin tilted up, drinking it down like the sweetest thing she had tasted all evening. And Ethan, my Ethan, stood 10 feet away with his hand on the small of her back, studying his own polished shoes as though the floor had become the most fascinating thing in the building. He did not defend me. He did not even have the courage to look ashamed. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count, and what stays with me is not Diane's voice. It is his silence. I set the coffee pot down carefully so that my hands would not betray me. Of course, ma'am, I said, level and clear, because my grandmother raised me to keep my voice steady when other people lose their manners, and because I would not give that room the show it had gathered to watch. I cleared the east tables. I stacked the ruined plates in careful towers. I wiped the rings of wine from the linen. And when the last of it was done, I walked back through the narrow service hall to the little staging room where I had left my things, and I let myself lean against the cold plaster wall for exactly one breath, before I made myself stand up straight again. This was not my life anymore, I told myself in that dim little room. Whatever I had believed this night would be, it was finished, and the only thing left to do was pack my grandmother's rolling pin into my case, drive home through the dark, and figure out how a woman starts over at 30 with an empty drawer full of plans that would never be built. I knelt and opened my catering case. I wrapped the pin in its soft cloth. I closed the lid and reached for the handle. And a hand came down flat on top of the case, wide and unhurried, heavy with a single silver ring, and held it shut. I did not have to look up to know the room behind me had gone completely quiet. I looked up anyway. It was the man from the head of the table. "You are not going anywhere," he said. "Sit at my table." His voice was quiet, and that was the first thing I understood about him, that he did not raise it, that he had never once needed to. He straightened to his full height, and I saw him whole for the first time, a tall man in a charcoal suit somewhere in his early 50s, silver threaded through his dark hair, a face carved down to stillness, eyes the flat gray of a lake in the hour before weather comes. He offered me his hand to help me up off the floor. Every instinct I owned, every hard rule I had learned about staying small in rooms like this, told me not to take it. I took it anyway. His grip was cool and certain, and he lifted me to my feet as though I weighed nothing, as though I were an honored guest and not the girl who had just been called to help in front of 200 people. "Your name," he said. It was not exactly a question, but he waited for the answer as though it mattered. "Naomi Carter," I said. "You baked the tarts." I blinked at him. I did. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, just the memory of where one might someday go. "They were the only honest things served in that room all night," he said. Then he tucked my hand into the crook of his arm, and he walked me back down the service hall and out into the wide, bright ballroom, and I felt the whole party turn toward us like a field of tall grass bending under a sudden wind. The music did not stop, but the talking did, table by table, as we passed. I watched a man lower his glass without drinking. I watched a woman lift her fingers to her throat. I did not understand it yet. I only knew that 10 minutes earlier I had been invisible, and now every eye in that room was following the caterer on this man's arm, and not one person was laughing anymore. He walked me the length of the floor to the head of the long table, to the empty seat at his own right hand, and he drew the heavy chair out for me himself. Across the room I saw Ethan's face drain to the color of ash. I saw Chelsea's bright smile freeze and slip clean off her face. I saw Diane Marchetti rise halfway out of her seat and then sink slowly back down, as though a heavy hand had pressed her shoulder, though no one had touched her. The man waited, patient, until I was fully seated. Then he lowered himself into the chair beside me, unfolded his napkin, and said to the silent room, "Naomi is my guest this evening. I trust every one of you will make her feel welcome." No one argued. That was the strangest part of the whole strange night. 200 people who an hour before would not have met my eyes now lifted their glasses toward me, because one man in a gray suit had told them, gently, that they would. A server I had never seen appeared at my elbow and set a plate in front of me, Real china edged in gold, a folded cloth napkin, and asked in a low respectful voice whether I would prefer water or wine, as though I had never once carried a tray through a room like this. And for the first time since Ethan raised that glass, something in my chest that had been clenched tight as a fist began, very slowly, to open. Not trust. I was hurt, but I was not a fool. What opened in me was hope, that small and dangerous thing, the barest sense that maybe I was not quite as disposable as every person in this family had already decided. The man turned in his chair to face me. "You are wondering who I am," he said. "You will want to be careful with the answer, once you have it." I asked him, quietly, for his name. He told me. And I felt the whole ballroom tilt beneath my chair, because it was the very same name as the man who had just betrayed me in front of everyone, and all at once I understood why the entire room was so afraid. Marchetti. Vincent Marchetti. Ethan's father. I sat very still while that name settled over me like cold water poured slowly down my back. Of course. The same strong jaw, the same dark hair, though where Ethan's face was soft and somehow unfinished, this man's was all clean edges and terrible patience. I had spent 2 years hearing that surname spoken in a strange hush, at the bank, at the permit office, by vendors who suddenly discovered open slots in their booked schedules the moment I mentioned which family I worked for. I had assumed it was the money. Watching a room full of powerful people carefully arrange their faces around this one still man, I finally understood it had never once been only money. Ethan had told me his father worked in real estate and hospitality. He had not told me that grown men fell quiet when Vincent Marchetti walked into a room, that a single soft word from him could open a locked door or close a life for good. I learned it that night in 100 small ways. I learned it in the way the host of the party, a sitting state senator, came to thank Vincent for attending and stood the whole time like a boy summoned to the principal's office. I learned it in the way a bodyguard I had not even noticed detached from the far wall and drifted 3 steps closer the instant Chelsea began moving toward us, then melted back into the shadows when Vincent lifted 2 fingers an inch off the white tablecloth. I was sitting at the right hand of the most feared man in the city, and now every person in that room knew my face. When Vincent excused himself to speak with the senator, Chelsea found her moment. She crossed to my chair and bent down close, and beneath the perfume and the wine her voice came out flat and low and only for me. "You have no idea what you are standing next to," she said. "Enjoy the china tonight, Naomi. People who get close to that man have a way of disappearing right out of the story. Ask around. Ask about the ones who came before you." Then she straightened, smiled for the room, and walked away on Ethan's arm as though she had done nothing but wish me well. I wanted, badly, to believe it was only jealousy. I could not quite make myself. Because I had felt it too, underneath Vincent's absolute stillness, the sensation of standing at the edge of something with no bottom. A man who could make a ballroom fall silent without ever lifting his voice was not a safe man to stand beside. Whatever had happened to me at that table, I had not stumbled into a rescue. I had stumbled into the orbit of a power I did not begin to understand, and I had a grandmother waiting at home who depended on me and had no one else in this world, and the thought of that power ever turning its gray eyes toward her turned my blood to ice. I had raised myself out of a 2-room apartment on the south side on the strength of one old woman's stubborn faith in me. Miss Pearl was 81. She had taken me in and raised me after my mother left, taught me every recipe I owned, kept a curling photograph of me in my chef's whites taped to her refrigerator door. If being seen by Vincent Marchetti meant being seen by everyone who feared him and everyone who hated him, then I had not been lifted up tonight. I had been made visible in the single most dangerous way a woman like me can be. I decided, right there at that gleaming table, that I would thank him politely, gather my things, drive home, and never come back. I would keep the one clean memory of being treated like a guest, and let the rest go. That was my plan. I even believed it. Then my phone buzzed hard against my hip, a number I knew by heart, Miss Pearl's next-door neighbor, calling at 11 o'clock at night, and my hands went cold before I even answered, and the small breaking voice on the other end said the word ambulance, and the whole gilded room fell away beneath me. I do not remember leaving the party. I remember the valet's startled face, and then the highway lights smearing long streaks past my windshield, and then the emergency room at Mercy General at midnight, the low fluorescent hum, the smell of antiseptic laid over old coffee. Miss Pearl looked so small on that gurney. Her hand inside mine was all bird bones and papery skin, and her eyes kept searching the ceiling for my face even when she could not quite find it. "Heart failure," a young resident said, moving fast, and then all at once everything stopped moving fast, because a woman behind a counter looked down at Miss Pearl's insurance card and her mouth pressed into a thin flat line I had seen my entire life. The coverage would not authorize the specialist unit. There was an old balance from a previous day. There were forms, and a number I could not begin to pay, and a policy that quietly turned a living human being into a column that did not add up. I stood at that counter and begged in a low voice so my grandmother would not hear me beg. I offered up my catering deposits. I offered my car. The woman behind the counter was not cruel. She was only tired, caught inside a machine that had already made its decision, the same machine that decides your worth before you open your mouth, and I felt the old helplessness close over my head like water. I did not call him. I want that on the record. I would never have asked. But somewhere in the blur of that party, I must have handed a server my card, or else Vincent Marchetti was simply a man who found things out. Because at 1 in the morning the double doors slid open, and he walked into that emergency room in the same charcoal suit, and the very air inside the building seemed to change temperature. He did not raise his voice. He never does. He spoke 6 quiet words to the woman behind the counter, then made a single phone call over by the vending machines with his back turned to me, and within 20 minutes my grandmother was being wheeled up into the cardiac unit on the 4th floor, with the exact specialist the resident had sworn was unavailable until Monday. No forms. No number. I turned to thank him and found I could not push a single word past my throat, and he only looked at me and said, "Sit with her. I will handle the rest." Here is the thing I was not prepared for. He stayed. A man who could have signed a check and walked back out to his idling car, who had a driver at the curb and 100 frightened people hanging on his next word, instead pulled a hard plastic chair into the corner of that small room and sat there through the entire night. Not close. He kept a careful, deliberate distance, as though he understood that his nearness was a heavy thing to carry. But every time I surfaced from the shallow, aching sleep you find in a chair beside someone you love, he was there, awake, his tie loosened, his gray eyes fixed on my grandmother's monitor as if the steadiness of his attention could keep that green line climbing. Near dawn Miss Pearl woke, clear-eyed for a moment, and saw him. "You the one paying?" she asked, because she has never once in her long life been shy. Vincent almost smiled. "No, ma'am," he said. "I am only making certain the people who ought to be doing their jobs actually do them." She studied him a long while, the way she studies everyone, straight down past the suit to the bone underneath. Then she said, "You watch my girl. Somebody finally ought to." And I saw something move across that carved gray face, something that had no business being there, the faint flicker of a man who had once, long ago, been watched over himself and had not been in a very long time. He looked at me across the thin gray light. "Get some rest, Naomi," he said, rising and buttoning his jacket. "On Monday, we need to talk. There is a lie living inside my house, and it has your name written all over it." Monday came in gray and cold off the lake. The Marchetti offices took up the top 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, and I rode the elevator up in my one good blazer with my stomach knotted tight, because a lie with my name on it could cost me everything I had left. A woman in a sharp suit led me to a conference room with a table long enough to seat 20, windows looking out over the whole gray sweep of the water. They were already there, waiting. Vincent at the head, still and unreadable. Diane at his left in another expensive silk, wearing the small tight smile of a woman who has been looking forward to this. Ethan near the far end, studying his hands. And Chelsea standing, because Chelsea had clearly asked to be the one to do this herself. She slid a leather folder down the polished table toward me, and it came to a slow stop against my fingertips. "We didn't want to believe it either," she said, in a voice pitched for sympathy and aimed straight at Vincent. "But the numbers just don't lie, Naomi." I opened the folder. Invoices. Dozens of them, printed on my own catering company's letterhead, billed to Marchetti Holdings for events I had never worked, spread across 18 months, adding up to more than $200,000. A bank account I had never opened, held in a name close enough to my own to fool a tired eye. Payments routed in, withdrawn, gone. My signature at the bottom of every page, close enough to my real hand that for one dizzy second I actually doubted myself. It was good work. That was the thing that frightened me most as I turned those pages. This was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. Someone had sat down with real patience and real skill and built a cage around me plank by careful plank, my letterhead, my near name, my forged signature, and they had been building it for 18 months, which meant it had begun long before Ethan ever raised that glass. Someone had been preparing to bury me since before I knew I would need saving. I looked up. Diane's thin smile had widened. "It is always the ones who play so humble," she murmured to the room. Ethan would not lift his eyes from the table. And Chelsea watched me with that same patient, satisfied expression she had worn the night of the party, the look of a woman enjoying a performance she had rehearsed for weeks. I closed the folder and set it down. My hands, and I am proud of this, did not shake, because my grandmother taught me long ago that the moment you let yourself look guilty is the moment they have already won. "I have never seen these accounts," I said, evenly, directly to Vincent, because he was the only person in that room worth speaking to. I did not open them. I did not sign a single one of these pages. Someone made them, and made them to look like me. Diane laughed softly. "Of course that is what you would say." But Vincent did not laugh, and he did not nod along with his sister, and I noticed then that he had not once glanced down at the folder. He was watching the people around it instead, one by one, the way a man watches a room he already owns down to the floorboards, and his gray eyes traveled from Chelsea's composed face to Ethan's bent head, and rested there a long, cold, deliberate moment. He had not called this meeting to accuse me. I understood it all at once, in the stillness of him, in the patient way he had let Chelsea talk and talk. He had called it to watch, quietly, to see exactly whose hand reached first for the knife. Enough, he said, quietly, and the room went silent the same way that ballroom had. He rose and buttoned his jacket and looked only at me. Naomi, come to the house tonight. Come alone. There is something I have been keeping for a very long time, and it is well past time you saw it with your own eyes. And across the table, at long last, Chelsea's smile began to fade. The Marchetti house at night was all long shadows and low golden lamps, and a silent housekeeper let me in and led me to a study-lined floor to ceiling with old books. Vincent stood waiting at a broad desk beneath a single burning lamp, and there on the desk lay a second folder, thicker than Chelsea's, its corners worn soft as cloth, as though it had been opened a great many times. Sit, he said. Then, after a moment, more gently, please. I sat. He opened the folder and turned it slowly to face me, and the truth came out one page at a time. Real invoices this time. Real accounts, a full year of them, tracing money out of Marchetti Holdings through the same kind of shell company Chelsea had tried to pin on me, except these were genuine, and these led somewhere real. They led to Ethan. His son. Page after page, more than $1 million over 3 years, siphoned quietly out of his own father's legitimate businesses and into private accounts, and out of those, and into Chelsea Vance's name. He has been stealing from me for years, Vincent said, and for the first time there was a rough, worn edge in his voice. Quietly. Patiently. And when he began to feel the ground shifting under his feet, when he understood I had started to look, he needed someone to hand me in his place. Someone believable. Someone with no name and no power to protect her when the fall came. He looked up at me. He chose you before he ever proposed to her. The forged paperwork was only insurance. You were always meant to be the thief they caught, so the real one could keep running. I sat with that a long moment. The cruelty of it was almost clean, it was so complete. This man had shared my bed and drawn sketches of a bakery, using my own recipes, all while building the trapdoor he intended to drop me through. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked, instead of letting it play out the way he planned. It would have been so easy. Every person in that room today wanted it to be me. Vincent was quiet a while. Then he came around the desk and took a smaller thing from a shallow drawer, a photograph, and set it on the wood in front of me. It was a picture taken at a repast, a funeral luncheon, folding tables and plain white cloths in a parish hall basement. And in the corner of the frame, half turned from the camera, a younger version of me in chef's whites knelt beside an old man in a wheelchair, a spoon in my hand, my head bent low to catch something he was saying. You catered my Uncle Sal's memorial luncheon 14 months ago, Vincent said. You will not remember me. I stood at the back. My entire family was there, and every last one of them found some reason to keep away from the old man, because by then his mind was going and he repeated his stories, and he was no longer useful to any of them. You were paid until 4 o'clock. At 6 you were still there, kneeling beside him, feeding him, listening to the same story about a fishing trip 3 times as though each time were the first. You never billed me for those hours. I checked afterward. He straightened. Uncle Sal raised me. He was the only one who ever did. And a complete stranger treated him as though he still mattered, when his own blood could not be bothered to sit beside him. The lamp buzzed faintly in the long silence between us. I have been watched and lied to my entire life, Naomi, he said at last. I know the difference, by now, between people who perform kindness for an audience and people who simply carry it inside them. I chose you a full year before my son ever thought to betray you. I was only waiting to see whether you might prove me wrong. He set a heavy pen down beside the true ledger. Tomorrow night I've called the entire family together. Every one of them. And I need to know whether you will sit at that table beside me and let them all see, at last, exactly whose hand reached for the knife. The family gathered the following night in the long dining room where all of it had begun, the same table, the same chandelier burning overhead, the same carefully arranged faces. Diane in her silk. Ethan pale and small at the far end. Chelsea beside him, dressed in white again, as though the color could still somehow protect her. 2 lawyers stood quiet along the near wall. And Vincent sat at the head of it all, unhurried, folding his hands one over the other. There was a single empty chair set at his right hand. I understood, standing in the doorway in a plain dark dress with my grandmother's steadiness holding up my spine, that the whole room was about to watch me make a choice. Ethan had chosen his mistress in front of 200 strangers, and then stood in silence while they called me the help. Now I crossed that gleaming floor while every eye in the room followed me, and I sat down in the chair at Vincent Marchetti's right hand, and I let the whole family watch me do it. He chose his mistress. I chose his father, the ruthless man his entire city feared, the one man at that table none of them dared to cross, and I chose him with my eyes wide open and my chin level. Vincent did not gloat. He simply opened the true ledger and let his lawyer lay the pages out down the length of the table, one after another, in front of each stunned and silent face. There was no shouting. There was no raised hand, no threat spoken aloud, nothing anyone alive could ever afterward call violence. There was only paper and a signature that was truly, provably Ethan's this time, and the slow, terrible silence of a room full of people watching a man be quietly undone by the plain record of what he had actually done. Ethan tried to speak. "Dad, please," Vincent lifted 2 fingers an inch off the white tablecloth, the exact gesture I had watched move armed bodyguards across a ballroom, and his son's voice died in his throat. "You used a stranger's name to cover your own theft," Vincent said, as quiet as ever. "You let this family stand in a ballroom and humiliate a woman who never took a single dollar from me, to protect a woman who took everything I had. You are not ruthless, Ethan. You are only weak, and you dressed your weakness up in the clothes of love and called it a wedding." He slid one last document down the table toward his son. It was not a check. It was the precise opposite of a check. Ethan's name struck clean from the company, from the accounts, from the family trust, from the will itself, every door in the whole empire swinging shut at once with the small dry scratch of a single pen. Chelsea was already on her feet, already reaching for her coat, her face doing the cold arithmetic, and the look Ethan turned on her then, the slow dawning that she had never once loved him, but only ever the money, was the single piece of justice I did not have to lift a finger to earn. Diane found her voice, thin and shaking with outrage. "Vincent, you cannot mean to place this caterer, above your own blood. She has a name," Vincent said, and did not even turn his head to look at his sister. "You will use it?" The room went silent again, that same deep silence. Every pair of eyes that had laughed at me a week before now could not find the courage to meet mine. I felt no triumph in it, only a strange and settling quiet, the sensation of a scale that had hung crooked my whole life finally, softly, coming level. I thought of Miss Pearl in her hospital bed, telling this hard man to watch over me. And I understood that the deepest justice of the whole night was not that Ethan lost every single thing he had. It was that he had to sit in that chair and watch me be treated, finally, as though I had always been worth something, which of course, all along, I always had been. The bakery opened on a bright Saturday morning in April, 6 months later, in a neighborhood that reminded me of the one that raised me. I painted the front door myself, a deep and warm green, and above it, in careful gold letters, I hung the name I had carried inside my chest my whole life without ever daring to say it out loud, Pearl's Kitchen. My own name sits on the business license underneath, Naomi Carter, owner, and I still stop sometimes on the sidewalk just to read it. Because not long ago a woman behind a counter looked at a card with my grandmother's name on it and decided the two of us were a column that did not add up. Miss Pearl was there for the opening. The specialist Vincent found that first cold night had done the very thing the machine would not let anyone do, and though she moves slower now and sits more than she stands, she settled into the best chair I owned beside the window and held court over every customer as though she had baked each loaf herself. Every recipe behind that glass came out of her cracked rolling pin and her patient, floured hands, the same hands that raised a motherless girl in 2 rented rooms and taught her that dignity is not a thing other people hand you. It is a thing you keep no matter what they try to take. I did not take Marchetti money to open my doors, and Vincent understood that without my ever having to say the words. I took a small, honest loan from a credit union that saw an actual person where the machine had once seen only a column. He offered, once, quietly, and when I told him no he never asked again, and never once made me feel small for the refusing. As for the two of us, I will tell you the truth, because I have told you nothing else. It is slow, and it is careful. A man 20 years older than I am, the father of the very man who betrayed me, and a woman who once baked tarts that nobody in a gilded ballroom would eat. We are not a simple story, and we have never pretended to be. He comes by on Thursdays, when the shop is quiet, and drinks his coffee black at the corner table while I count out the register, and mostly, gently, we leave the past where it lies. He has never once made me feel like something he rescued. He waited a full year to be sure of me before he said a word, and there is a deep, quiet safety in being chosen that slowly, chosen for the thing you already are rather than the thing somebody needs you to become. Ethan I have not seen. I hear he moved to another state, that Chelsea left him within a month, that he is learning what it means to carry a name that no longer opens doors. I flour my work table at 4 o'clock every morning, the way my grandmother taught me. I hand a warm roll across the counter to a tired man on his way to work and watch his whole face change. I catch Vincent Marchetti watching me from the corner table over the top of his book, wearing an expression that carved gray face was never built to hold, and I let him watch, and I let myself be seen. And here is what I know now that I did not know at the beginning. A man once lifted a glass to another woman and let an entire room decide I was worthless, and for one terrible night I nearly believed him. But my worth was never his to give or take. It was never that room's, or that machine's, or that whole cold family's. It was mine the entire time, in my grandmother's hands and in my own, in the honest work and in the name above a warm green door. He chose his mistress. I chose myself and a good man who could finally see me, and a life built on the solid ground of being wanted for exactly who I already am. And I have learned, at last, that being valued for your true worth is the only crown in this world that never slips, because no one can ever take from you the one thing they never had the power to give.